Hello and welcome to Enterprise Tech Spotlight with InfoSystems. My name is Keith Hales, and on this podcast we help business leaders get educated and get informed about the technology systems and processes and really just what's the latest and greatest in technology in their business. So joining us today is Robert Goodwin, our CTO. Robert, thanks for joining us today.
Hey, Keith, appreciate it. Good to be here.
Well, I am excited about our topic today about modern infrastructure because that really could be taken a lot of different ways. We hear all kinds of marketing things around modern infrastructure. I'm sure that might even be trademarked, so let's not put that in any kind of writing. But for our topic today, when we're talking about modern infrastructure, when it comes to technology systems, that really means how the world has changed from just kind of internal traditional IT hardware and systems for servers and that type of thing to we've got hyper-converged systems, which are a different approach. They're cloud systems, which is obviously a very different approach to technology. And then we have hybrid, where an organization might have two or more of these different systems that they're somehow integrating on-prem and cloud and making all these things work together. So Robert, I guess the question I want to start with is help the listeners understand what the major components or the major areas of the modern infrastructure stack looks like.
All right. So let's break it down into the major components you said. Let's start with traditional. All right. So traditional is your typical, it's either on your premise or in a co-location facility, right? It's your servers, your storage network, all that stuff, all the components, rack and stacked, cabled, configured, managed directly. You're patching it, you're firmware in it, you're doing all the what I call the blood and guts of the IT world.
The care and feeding.
The care and feeding. This is all the stuff in the nitty gritty you've got to do. That's traditional infrastructure.
So another way to say that is that's if somebody buys servers and puts them in their stack, or maybe they buy servers in a SAN, which is a storage area network, separate storage. And then they might have switches which connect all these things at the top of the rack, and then obviously from there it goes up to the rest of their business network on their local area network. So that's traditional storage, usually in a data center, maybe an on-premise data center in their office or warehouse. Sometimes that whole thing might be in an off-site third-party data center where they provide other services like better network connections, more reliable power, better security than they would have on their own premise.
Or a combination thereof, because you may have a DR implementation where you have some on your physical premise as well as in a co-located facility in a geo-different location.
So before we go down the path of talking about some of these others, that is 15 years ago. That is what probably 98% of the companies had. Has that died? Has that business model completely died?
Oh, no. Absolutely not. If anything, it's actually becoming a resurgence.
Okay.
We'll get into that a little bit later. I don't want to get ahead of myself too much here. You've heard the old cliche, tape's dead?
Yeah. Tape's
not dead. Solid traditional infrastructure is not dead.
Okay. All right. We'll talk more about that. All right. So the second one is, let's go ahead and jump to cloud, and then we'll come back to the hyper-converged here in a minute. So cloud infrastructure. So when I say that, what I mean is the hyperscalers or the companies like a Microsoft Azure service, an AWS service, a Google service. So what is that?
That is somebody else's gear in a data center at its purest form. All right, because I love the term cloud because everybody's like, "What's in the cloud?" No, it's just somebody else's gear. It is infrastructure that you don't own, that you don't have to manage. Right. It's infrastructure, kind of almost infrastructure as a service, where the hyperscaler just because the litany of list of people that do cloud.
Right.
The hyperscalers provide the infrastructure. They manage it, they patch it, they maintain it, they do all the good stuff. They ensure resiliency, and the data centers are all squared away. That's no longer the end user's concern or the IT personnel's concern. You run systems on that infrastructure as a service. Is another way of thinking about it.
So before we leave the topic, there's something that is maybe a little unique about these hyperscalers is the interface or the way that you interact with, the way an IT person would interact with these systems, how they would set them up, how they would manage them is slightly different than a traditional on-premise.
It is more than slightly different in my opinion, but it is different because instead of you normally hook a cable to, or you get network access to the physical server, and you do all the carving, slicing, and dicing, and all the stuff. You're creating a virtual environment on the system. So in the cloud, you just get handed resources, right? And you run a script, and you create your virtual machine, or your virtual server, or your virtual network, virtual storage. You're literally creating things out of resources that they just present to you. Okay. So it's very, I'm going to say, almost programmatic in its interface and the way you deal with these systems, right? Versus the traditional hardware guy who's, I'm going to plug the hard drives in, and I'm going to boot the server and lay an OS layer down and do all these things. Yeah, that's vastly different in the cloud side.
Okay. So let's talk about something that typically lives on the traditional side of the house, but it has some unique things that might lean in a little bit towards cloud, and that's called hyper-converged infrastructure. So for those who haven't heard that term, Robert, do you mind explaining what that is? And maybe even give a couple of company examples.
All right. So hyper-converged technology is, you think about your data center and compress it, right? So instead of multiple racks of compute and then racks of storage and racks of networking, you've got a rack of networking, compute, storage, all integrated together, right? So they almost act as a mini cloud.
Okay.
Right.
But inside of your data center.
It's inside your data center, right? You control and own and do to it just like you do the traditional infrastructure, except it's a little easier on the IT staff because it's so integrated. Instead of doing multiple levels of patching, you're really just kind of doing one level of patching, right? So that's where some of the administrative overhead decreases. Some of the let's see, who's some of the vendors?
VxRails.
VxRails is
from Dell.
From Dell. Nutanix is another one.
Is it Simplicity?
Simplicity, I believe.
Yeah, I know that was HP's.
It was HP's. So again, this is just topic. There are multiple vendors and various, but essentially all it is you've taken compute, network, and storage and integrated it so tightly that, like the cloud side, you roll into a single interface and you provision and create and do, and you're not having to deal with all the individual components that you did in the traditional infrastructure layer.
So those are the different options, generically speaking. So as far as most companies today, we see most companies not just selecting one of these. Most of these companies have at least two of these platforms, cloud and some form of local infrastructure.
And some instances we see all three.
Okay.
Right, because you may have a need for traditional infrastructure.
Or maybe you've already invested in traditional infrastructure.
Maybe you were trying to run out the investment, right? That's a fair point. Or and there's a lot of times that, and I'm gonna pick on some of the ERP systems,
sure, like Oracle or SAP,
right? That the vendor provides. It's almost it's a package deal.
Gotcha.
Here's some infrastructure. Typically they manage and configure and patch and stuff, but it's traditional server infrastructure, network infrastructure, storage infrastructure that Oracle, SAP, or I can't think of the ERP system.
Epicor,
thank you. So they have so you may have traditional infrastructure in data center because of that application need. I've seen customers that have that as well as a hyper-converged environment, and then on top of that, they want to DR to the cloud. Now what you've just created is a hybrid environment, right? That's where the term hybrid comes from, because you're on premise and operational in the cloud. But some people don't realize you can actually have both cloud and still be hybrid, right? You could be hybrid between the hyperscalers.
Yeah, because you could choose to put maybe your production environment, let's just say Microsoft Azure, but then for redundancy purposes, you choose to put your DR in AWS, for example.
Correct. That's still considered, well, they call it hybrid cloud, but it's a hybrid environment nonetheless, because hybrid becomes when you're in two forms of infrastructure, be it cloud, on-premise cloud, hyper-converged cloud, or hyper-converged and traditional infrastructure. Those are traditionally hybrid environments.
So for those who are unfamiliar with this conversation, what they just heard is, holy cow, that's really complicated. Why in the world would anybody choose to go down the path of having 2 or 5 different systems? So let's talk a little bit about the pros and cons of each of these. So let's start with the real simple traditional infrastructure. So I want to hey, it's time for me to refresh my infrastructure. I need to buy a SAN, local storage area network. I need to buy some servers that I'm going to put VMware on. I need to buy some type of switch to connect all these things together. And then I'm going to, connect that to my main network, my firewalls, and all that other stuff. So what are the pros and cons of that approach?
So one of the pros for traditional infrastructure is you have, I'm not going to say infinite, but you have great flexibility with what you can do in your environment. You can really kind of customize it down to the way you want it to work, how you want it to work. One of the cons of that, as I mentioned earlier, you got to maintain and firmware and patch and hard drives fail, CPUs fail, memory fail.
You're responsible.
You're
for this
responsible
custom
for
thing
You've created this really cool custom environment. Now you got to maintain it.
So we'll talk more about this at the end, but from a total cost of ownership, that custom built environment can be a less expensive option because you're buying what you need and you're not buying all the other stuff that you may or may not be leveraging.
Yes, we'll definitely dive into that one later. But I don't want to say economy of scales, but you can scale your environment. That's another pro to the custom environment or traditional infrastructure. I can scale it to what I need. Mm-hmm. Right. Not to jump ahead. Yeah, you can do the same thing with the other two, but because it's a custom environment, you can control how much and how far or how little I want to grow that environment.
Okay.
Right.
So let's talk about specifically the cloud environment. So these cloud providers. So what are some of the pros and cons of that?
All right. Cloud environment pro, it's easy. You can spin a server up in an instant, literally. Boom, done. All right. It's easy to get into. Mm-hmm. You can transfer your data in there very easily. One of the cons is you have to be very careful because it's so easy. You get what I call server and application sprawl. Well, Jane over in accounting needs a server. Oh, okay, boom, here it is. Freddie over here needs a box in R&D. Boom, there it is. Nobody's tracking the cost on that.
Well, it's called hyperscaler for a reason because these systems can typically scale from a few servers to thousands very quickly, which is fantastic for some business use cases.
R&D, test dev. Those are great uses of this because you spin the environment up, do all the stuff you need to do, spin it down.
Yeah.
Trying to run, you can, but people do. They run production environments. The born on the cloud, right? Mm-hmm. Some of the smaller companies that are born on the cloud, and it's really easy to get up and running. And that's a perfect niche for that, right? Because you're not investing as a business owner, right? You don't know if you're going to have to make this massive investment, capital investment into infrastructure, or I just do it as an OpEx inside of the cloud as I start out.
So, all right, so that makes sense. So going back to the hyper-converged infrastructure, the Nutanix, the VxRails, for example,
right?
So what are some of the pros and cons of that?
Let's see. Pros for hyperconverged is like traditional infrastructure, you still have some control on it, but it's simpler to manage. And what I mean by that is again, I go back to that, it's a single interface, right? It's all compressed and it's all tightly integrated. It's easy to grow and scale.
It is easy to scale because most of those systems
are node-based.
They're node-based, so you might buy 3 to start with.
Yes.
And then if you want to add 2 more nodes or 2 more boxes that have all this stuff built in, you just add them and the system automatically just scales to it.
It is literally the easy button. You plug it in, you hit the button on the front, and the system, as I like to call it, it absorbs it. Right. It literally will just, here's your new capacity, we're good to go. Right. So you can grow those really easily, and as long as you've got the rack space and the power to support it, you're good to go. One of the cons is hyper-converged environments are not as flexible.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, we've seen this with some of our customers that maybe they bought the hyper-converged environment to do one thing,
correct,
but then they need it to. We have one customer that they needed it just to be their primary back-end file share. So they were just using it for basic local servers for print service, Active Directory, and shared files, and a couple of small applications.
Right.
And then they had a need to run their ERP system on it, and they put the wrong type of hard drives in that hyper-converged environment, and they couldn't. They put slow, cheap disk in there,
right?
And they couldn't.
They didn't have the
modify
performance need, yes,
to add in some SSD, some solid-state drives for better performance, and so they ended up having their ERP system move over and just have terrible performance because it wasn't flexible after the fact.
That's a perfect example of what I mean by not flexible.
Yeah.
Right? Again, patching and your administrative overhead on a hyper-converged environment is a lot simpler, but you have the inflexibility to deal with.
Okay. So let's talk cloud. So pros and cons of cloud. Or excuse me, hybrid. I said cloud.
Okay, thank you.
I meant hybrid. I apologize. Where you have 2 or 3 of these different environments working together.
You were testing me. I know what you're doing. So hybrid. So some of the pros are, I'm just, as an example, let's say traditional and you go to a hyperscaler for DR.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. It's easy to implement. You've already got your traditional infrastructure. You know what to do and how to do it. As I said earlier, it's real easy to get into hyperscalers. So you can set up, and a lot of the systems today, especially a lot of your storage systems and even some of the server infrastructure, VMware things, have built-in API support to directly talk to the hyperscalers. So if for replication of data, replication of applications, we've gotten to the point now in technology where that's actually really easy to do.
Mm-hmm.
That's relatively easy to do. So that's a pro. The con is now you're still dealing with 2 distinct different environments. So your skill set, the skill set to admin and manage a cloud environment is different, even though you wouldn't think so, from a traditional infrastructure. The traditional infrastructure person you got to be more hardware centric. You need to understand the back end network and what are the performance considerations, like you just touched on, disk performance, server performance, memory performance. You kind of need to know that. So it takes multiple highly skilled people to operate that environment. Whereas in a cloud environment, because you don't have to worry about the back end, you're really more at the application layer and OS layer. That's a different skill set.
Okay.
So your con is you have to have skill sets and abilities to manage across both platforms.
Okay. So with that, we're actually going to put a pause on this topic and make this a 2-part podcast because we are trying to keep our podcast to a certain length of time. So we're going to stop this podcast for right now, but we're going to release part 2 very soon after release part 1. So Robert, thank you for joining us on this part 1. We're going to go ahead and end it now, and we'll get to part 2 here shortly.
Looking forward to it.
Thank you for joining us, and we hope you can join us for part 2, which should be released shortly.